I'm Tammy Dorr, President and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership and co-founder of Denver Startup Week. This week is so important. It's important for us to come together and think big and boldly about our future, to dream and have visions for companies. These companies that are built today will be our economic strength, our economic drivers, and our economic saviors for the future of both our region, our state, and our country. We don't take it lightly. Come together during this week and make things happen. Before we dive in, we want to say a special thank you to our 2020 Denver Startup Week sponsors who make it all possible. Thanks to our title sponsors, Downtown Denver Partnership, JPMorgan Chase, Prologis, and Zero. And our track sponsors who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible. Battery 621 and the Public Works, Capital One Cafe, Colorado Lending Source, Friday Health, Quizlet, Exactly, Zayo, and Zestful. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement to all of you this week. Thank you to Wix, Kenzen, MAPR Agency, Obsidian HR, Kickstart Fund, Promontory Mortgage, Molson Coors, and Comcast. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors. They're all listed on the screen. Thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, make things happen.
Welcome, Denver Startup Week. We're at day 3 of the 2020 virtual Denver Startup Week. First time in history, 100% of our sessions are 100% online. And it's been so fun to see folks from Brazil, Barcelona, Italy, as far as London, Hawaii, all over the world tuning in to what Denver has going on in our startup community. I'm Eric Matisik. I'm the CEO and president of Highwing, and I'm also one of the co-founders of Denver Startup Week. I couldn't be more excited to be here with this session to talk about the awesomeness of Jerry Colonna and his book, Reboot. So first, before we get to it, I want to make sure that we recognize our sponsor for this entire track of awesome content, MAPR Agency. Welcome back, Denver Startup Week. Couldn't be more excited for this session. MAPR Agency, thank you so much for your generosity, your time, and your leadership to bringing this entire portfolio of content alive. I'd love to welcome you to our Innovation Author Showcase. The spirit of this content was broken into 5 sessions, the art of writing a book with 4 amazing authors, and then digging deep into each author and their work. And today we're with the awesome Jerry Colonna with Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. For those of you who don't know Jerry, Jerry's the CEO and co-founder of REBOOT.io, an executive coaching and leadership development firm dedicated to the notion that better humans make better leaders. Prior to being a coach, he was a partner with JPMorgan Partners, a private equity firm, and previously was one of the founders of Flatiron Partners, where he founded with his friend Fred Wilson in 1996. That venture firm went on to be one of the most successful in the region. His book, Reboot, Leadership, and the Art of Growing Up, is a journey of radical self-inquiry, which I can't wait to get into the word radical, helping you reset your life and sorting through emotional baggage that's holding you back professionally, and even more important, in your relationships. Jerry, absolute welcome.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all you guys are doing to make Denver Startup Week feel like Denver Startup Week, even though we live in this weird virtual time.
Thank you, Jerry. Really appreciate it. Before we get started, to make most for everybody that's listening today, everybody that's tuned in, we want to make sure that this is a Ask Me Anything format. And so Jerry's going to be taking and fielding your questions. So think about the things that are the highest value to you, and we'll begin answering those about halfway through the session. Please add those to the chat feature, and we'll go from there. So Jerry, I have to ask, you've been involved in startup communities, venture, tech stars for as long as I can remember, and Reboot, the Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, your book, as well as all your programs, have always been referred to me as world-class. I remember hearing when I first heard about you from some of my fellow Techstars friends that as you were booting up some of your local retreats, Eric, you're not going to believe this, but I felt every single emotion that I had with Jerry, include crying. You live your life and inspire others to live their life with the soul and deep meaning. And I deeply admire you for all those things that you're able to bring to life in our founders here in our community. Can you start by telling us about Reboot and the company and the book and your passion for serving founders and high growth CEOs?
Sure. I'm hesitant because I tend to not like commercials. So I won't tell you so much about the company as much as I'll tell you about the work, because that's more important to me. First, I just appreciate what you just said, and maybe the best way to answer that question is to go a little bit around about it and talk about why I do what I do. And I think that this speaks to the reputation for making people cry and the reputation for making people feel the fullness of their experience. As a lot of people know, I was a former venture capitalist, relatively successful. When in the middle of my 30s, I suffered a second depression, and a serious depression, to the point where I had suicidal ideation, and which was an important thing to note, because when I was a teenager, I had attempted suicide. And the real root of that was that I was not living the life that I was meant to live, even though I was successful, which is really confusing. And so fast forward to where I am today and why I do what I do, whether it's on an individual basis or even why we founded Reboot and why we dedicate ourselves the way we do, is because we don't want people to suffer. Founding a company, being an entrepreneur, being a leader, arguably being an adult, is really, really hard. And I have dedicated my life to trying to make that process just a little bit easier for people. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do is retroactively go back in time and make it easier for myself. So that's a long-winded way of answering the question. Everything that we do at Reboot, whether it's the stuff that we do for free or the stuff that we do that's expensive, is really designed to make that journey easier for people.
why the focus on founders and high growth CEOs? What's the intrinsic passion there to give back so much to that specific group of people?
Well, it's evolved over time. I'll note that, and my personal client base has grown beyond founders and entrepreneurs. But I will always have a soft spot for founders and entrepreneurs. Years ago, I hit upon a phrase, pathological optimism. And the thing that really strikes me about the entrepreneurial community is that they look at the world and they see opportunity implicit in the problems. And, if you take a step back and you think about where we are in 2020, the dumpster fire after dumpster fire that is the world as it exists right now, right? We're here because the pandemic was mishandled. Let's be honest, that's really why we're doing what we're doing, how we're doing. There are thousands of entrepreneurs who are looking at those dumpster fires and saying, I have an idea. That human spirit moves me deeply and inspires me greatly. And I've seen it in as far away as in Tibet, in Germany, in Sweden, in Ireland, in Africa. I've seen it everywhere. And that's just, that's what draws me to this community time and time again.
One of the things you said on Monday that I picked up on was you said a book is a souvenir of an experience. What did you mean by that? And specifically, it sounds like you started a little bit in your intro to capture that experience in Reboot, but what was the big souvenir that you've put together with Reboot?
Well, to be fair, I was quoting my good friend and sometime teacher Seth Godin, who in a talk long time ago to the American Booksellers Association talked about books as souvenirs of experiences. And I just love that phrase. When I was writing Reboot, I held that in the back of my mind and realized that the experience that I wanted to create was the same kind of experience that can happen, whether it's I take an entrepreneur for a walk up Sanitas Hill here in Boulder, or they come to one of our boot camps, or we sit across a Zoom screen. It's the notion of two humans coming together intimately, honestly, authentically, no bullshitting, really showing up for themselves. And what I wanted was to recreate that experience in the book so that people would know that they would walk away with a talisman that says, I had a human-to-human, heart-to-heart connection and experience. And so that's what I meant.
That's awesome, Jerry. When you think about that connection, it's obviously become really transparent in all the work that you do. You talk a lot about transparency and authenticity throughout all of your work. One of the elements I saw is, owning your shadows and cutting through the monsters to cut your head down to size. And I use the phrase full catastrophe living, which you quoted John Kabat-Zinn, which is really the living the mindful of the ups and downs of life. Why are those values so important to your work? And how did they enter your life with your experiences that built upon the book?
How did they repeat the last question?
How did those values emerge as you started to build out the book?
So let's just take a step back. I tend not to use the word authentic as much as I use the phrase being real. And
I like that.
The phrases authenticity and vulnerability, while are really important, can be triggering in their own right because we inject in them certain judgments. Certain folks are acculturated to believe that vulnerability equals weakness. In fact, it is a synonym for weakness in some ways, right? This item has a vulnerability is a phrase. But the notion of being real, dropping in and being real is incredibly important. And that means being fully real, not just cherry picking the best of ourselves, but allowing the fullness of ourselves to do that. Now, there's a corollary belief system around this, which is that those who hold power, either by role or by virtue of the meat bag that society places on me, have a greater responsibility to show up and be real than anyone else in the room. And so, for example, I am a white cisgendered male. I have power and privilege that I am not even cognizant of. Therefore, if I want to see the world be a safe place for the people that I care about, or for anybody to feel that they belong, I have a greater than average responsibility to show up and be real, to be myself. Now, there's a corollary, there's an important cautionary note here that is not licensed to be toxic just because you're being real. It means showing up and being fully present to even the internalized messes that are within me.
When you talk about being your real self, one of the things that really jumped out to me was this notion of radical self-inquiry. And you use the word radical throughout your work. From a radical perspective, like, how did you stumble upon that, and really how did it emerge?
Well, radical self-inquiry is a phrase I coined to describe the process by which the mass of delusions that we normally carry are stripped away so that we don't have any place to hide. Now, what I often say in describing that is they're stripped away with compassion. Right? And what makes it radical is that we tend not to do it. Right? And my now somewhat infamous radical self-inquiry question that really rattles people is I look them in the eye and I say, no, how are you? No, really, how are you? Don't bullshit me. Tell me how you're really feeling. Now, it's radical because we typically don't answer that question. It's radical because we typically don't even know the answer to that question. And it's radical because the other person typically is not in a position to hear it. We're typically too wrapped up in our own bubble of experience to actually look somebody in the eye who's just handed us a cup of coffee for $2 and to actually worry about or be concerned with how their heart is. That's what makes it all radical.
I've heard the stories of getting to people's heart. One of the things that Bart Lorang mentioned to me is he said, Jerry's such an incredible storyteller. You've got to get him to tell the story of Mila Ripa and disappearing into the fire, and really that uncovering of the heart in deep anxiety and struggle. And I'd cue it up to that. And what does it mean to disappear into the fire?
So in classic Bart fashion, hey Bart, how you doing? He's conflated two different stories, or maybe you have. So there's Milarepa's story, which he was referring to, and the story of the potter. So what I'll do, the first thing I'll do is I'll just mention who Milarepa was. Milarepa was a Buddhist teacher. And there's a story that I can tell about Milarepa confronting some the truth of his life. But we'll put that to the side for a moment and speak about this notion of disappearing into the fire. And I think the reason that Bart brings this up is because when I first heard this story, it seemed so obvious to me that this is a story about our relationship to work. And for many entrepreneurs, it's a story about their relationship to their companies. And the story goes like this, and to give credit where credit is due, I first read this story in David White's Crossing the Unknown Sea. And so he tells the story this way. There's an ancient potter who had spent his entire life trying to perfect the most exquisite glaze imaginable. And at the end of his life, and this is important, deciding that his meaningful life is over, he walks into the kiln and disappears into the fire. And the next day, the potter's assistants open up the kiln, take out their pots, and they're covered with the most exquisite glaze imaginable. And the potter has disappeared. And as I like to say, that story bothers the shit out of me. Because I fully understand the wish to perfect, to create the perfect, most exquisite glaze, to make that your life's work. But it kills me to think that in order to make that happen, you have to disappear. It's a paradox, and there are ways out of the paradox, but it took me a long time to understand that. And, just to finish out the point, I related to that story early on in my post-investor career because I understood that I myself had walked into the fire in my 30s and I had disappeared into my work, and that I had done so without really any consciousness of what was happening to me. I had merged my identity and self-worth with the goal, the glaze, to the point where I had disappeared.
Wow, that's a really powerful story, especially about the relationship with our own death and the timing of where we spend our time. And so that's a really, really powerful story. When I was talking with Nicole, I think a lot of the people within the Colorado community, especially the CEOs that you've worked with, always refer to you as the CEO whisperer. And one of the questions that came up was, how does he do it? Like, just how does he know the exact right thing to say at the exact moment? What's Jerry picking up on? Like, what's that human piece that he's learned that he sees?
Well, it's very kind, and shout out to Nicole. That's Nicole Glaros from Techstars. It took me a while to understand what's happening in those moments. And the first answer that I would often come to when people would ask that is, I just listen. But it's actually more complicated than that. And in my book, I describe what developed as a child growing up in very difficult family circumstances. I describe what I developed as a hypervigilance. And those children, those folks who were children of, say, adult alcoholics will know that notion of hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is a term to describe the ways in which we prick up our ears and we pay attention to even the most minute actions going on in a room. Right? So for example, you're looking down in a way, I might read into that because you're taking notes and I might be feeling into that. The difference is that what I've done, and I started doing this early in my adult career, the difference is that I pay very, very close attention to those things. Now, as a child, I did that in order to stay safe, because who knew if you were going to flinch and an arm would come across and I'd get smacked in the face. Today, as an adult, what I do is I pay very, very close attention. And I often say I have two eyes. I have one eye on the other person and one eye on myself. And what I'm doing is paying attention to how my body feels. I'm paying attention how something is happening inside of me. And then I ask a question from there. Because I'm listening beyond the words. I'm listening to the feelings. I'm listening to the body sensations. By the way, this may come across like a superpower, but anybody can do this.
Speaking of, when you say anyone can do this, how do founders turn that on? Like, empathy and leadership is so important to growing, great leadership teams and great companies. Like, how do you explain to somebody that they can do it too?
Okay, so I like what you just did there was you made an association between listening deeply and empathy. And that's important because somewhere as you were listening to what I was saying, you were making an association. And that's what got drawn in. Okay, and you made the leap to empathy. See what I did there?
I did. That was good.
Okay. So I'll speak to the empathy. And what I'll do is I'll expand it is, yes, you're speaking to founders and you're cognizant of founders because this is Denver Startup Week. But the truth of the matter is, we all can do this with each other. I remember two boot campers. Boot camp is the term we use for an immersive weekend experience. Two boot campers came back from what we do is a dialogue walk where we teach people how to listen deeply. And they came back from going for walks for about 40 minutes. And one person just with tears in his eyes said, I have never been listened to like that before in my life. And then he paused and he said, why don't we do this all the time? And so your question was, can we teach founders to do this? I'm going to expand that question and say, can we teach each other to do this? Can we grow to that point? If we go back to the original question of better humans make better leaders, let's start with the most fundamental human skill, the ability to listen deeply to one another. So that when you walk away from the conversation, you say to yourself, I have never felt heard in that way before. I have never felt loved, safe, and that I belong in quite the way that I feel now.
Here's the big question. Everyone wanted to know this. What's the shortest amount that you've made somebody cry? And what was that big trigger? Because
under a minute. but to be fair, what typically happens is, in those instances, people are coming in and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm going to talk to Jerry. I'm going to cry," But typically, what happens is, this is actually a good build upon what we were just talking about. I'll do a talk. I'll do a big public talk back in the day when we would do public talks. And then, as is often the case, people sort of line up at the end to talk to the speaker. And then they'll come up and they'll look at me. And they want to say something. But Eric, what they want is to feel that they belong. And what I do is I will just stay present and I will look in their eyes. And I will tell them mentally, you're welcome. Whatever you're bringing, you are welcome. And unconsciously, the floodgates open at that moment. And all that tells me is that, we can spend all this time in the world trying to complain about toxic behavior this and awful behavior this way. But if we could create communities of belonging, where even the most marginalized in our communities felt safe, then for God's sake, maybe we have a shot as a species.
That's beautiful. It's on a personal level. There's nothing better than feeling like you belong somewhere, whether that's in your family, whether that's in your startup community, whether that's in your company, whether that's within your friendships. It's.
Can I link back to something you asked before? You were asking about radical self-inquiry.
Yeah.
There's nothing better than feeling like you belong to yourself.
Oh.
Right? And when we start the day, like I start my day with a journaling.
You make me cry.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Guess what, Eric? You belong. You deserve to sit there. Yeah. One of the big, I'm going to make a reference to Buddhism. I apologize if anybody feels uncomfortable with that. But the thing that really blew me away when I first started studying Buddhism was the notion that I know that I am good, fundamentally, basically good, because I took birth in a human body. and only human beings can come close to enlightenment. Now, you can argue all sorts of merits of that argument, but for me, it answered the fundamental question of, do I belong on this planet? And I think that is the deep wound that we are all carrying, and that is the deep wound that people who hold power project onto other people time and time again. You okay?
Yeah, I'm gonna let that one sit for a second.
All right. It's okay. They can see you cry.
Who's the Jerry Whisperer? You help so many people, and you're the CEO whisperer to so many influential individuals. But who do you lean into when you need help? I think you touched on it a little bit, with being a Buddhist. But you're good at asking. Everyone's good at asking you for help. Who do you ask for help? Are you good at that? Who do you lean on? Who's your whisperer?
Those are two questions. Am I good at asking for help, and who do I lean on?
Yeah.
My life partner, Allie, would tell you that I'm terrible at asking for help. In fact, I typically reject help that is offered. So that's a piece of work that's still out there for me. But the larger issue is I feel incredibly well supported most times. I work in the world's best company, and I am surrounded by some of the best colleagues walking the face of the earth. I have the world's most amazing life partner in Allie Schultz. I still, and my book is dedicated not only to my children, but to my former therapist, Dr. Viva Sayers, who passed away 3 years ago. She lives in my heart. I talk to her every day. And most times she's yelling at me. I have Sharon Salzberg as a Buddhist teacher. I have Parker Palmer as one of my dearest friends. I have Brad Felt as not only a neighbor, but, a curmudgeon that I can hang out with and complain about the world with, And so, and I do feel like I can lean on many, many people. And I appreciate the question, because behind the question is a care and concern for me. And I appreciate that.
Well, audience, we're getting up to the time where we're going to be moving to your questions and answers. I just took a peek, and there's a bunch of questions in there. So put your final questions in. We'll ask one more question, and then we'll jump right into everything that you've put in there. So Jerry, before we flip to questions for the audience, being a coach, being a venture capitalist, being an investor, what's the piece of advice that you consistently, kind of your bedrock advice that you give CEO and founders in coming to grips with their own radical self-inquiry, but most importantly, relating to your work?
Well, if we go back to the Potter story for a moment, so much difficulty stems, so much bad behavior on the part of a CEO, so much self-sabotage on the part of a leader stems from tying a sense of self-worth to accomplishment of the goal. I will paraphrase William James, the great American psychologist and sometime Buddhist, when he said that it is not failure that annihilates us, but it's when we attach a sense of self-esteem to accomplishment of a goal and then fail that we are annihilated. The problem is, broadly speaking, and we do this to our children at a very, very early age, we reward the outcome and not the effort. And the result is that I only feel loved, safe, and that I belong if I get an A. And nothing could be further from the truth. And we know this intellectually, but it is hardwired into our personalities. And part of growing into the full catastrophe adult that is your birthright is to come to understand that companies fail and companies succeed. Stock prices go up, stock prices go down. Revenue comes in, revenue goes out. Expenses go up, people live, people die. But I am worthy, regardless.
So Jerry, from the audience, Ryan asks, he said, Jerry, I've read your book. You push the reader to ask the question, how am I responsible for creating the conditions I say I don't want? In your experience in coaching executives and leaders, what are the common themes that emerge with this question?
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for reading the book. And actually, I'm going to modify the question, because the way I ask the question is important to understanding the root of the question. What I note is not responsible, but complicit. And here's the way I say it. How have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? Now, the word complicit is important here because, as I like to point out, you're an accomplice. You're driving the getaway car. You're not sticking up the bank teller. And that's important because what happens early on is that in order to respond to the wounds of our life, we develop, in my book, I refer to them as subroutines, good programming language. We create belief systems. But the responsible impetus is actually the event, is the wounding. And you are not responsible for having been wounded. And that's a really important lesson here, especially for those of us who grew up with adverse childhood environments. We are not responsible for the pain. We are only responsible for our actions and our reactions. But what happens is there are these feelings and belief systems that start to get laid in. And so, for example, a belief system I developed as a child was that it was safer to be anxious than angry. That belief system had a truth, because if I was angry, I would get hit. And nobody wants to get hit, so it's better to be anxious than angry. As I became an adult, what I began to realize was that I started to create anxiety in my life because it felt safe. And that's where I was complicit in it. I would say I don't want to feel anxious, but the reality was I wanted to feel safe, and the way to feel safe was to feel anxious. A logic that falls flat when you're an adult, but makes perfect sense when you're 5 years old.
Thanks, Jerry. Emily asks, how do you recommend founders grow their businesses without walking into the fire?
Great question. So I said that there was a way out of the paradox, and this is the way out of the paradox. There are going to be times, Emily, when you will have to walk into the fire. There are going to be times when you will have to pull all-nighters and say no to that family event. That's not actually the fire. The fire is walking into the kiln and not knowing why you're walking into the kiln. To walk in, to give up and not realize that you're doing it because you're running away from the demon, which says, oh my God, if I don't pull this all-nighter, then everything's going to fall apart and I'm going to fail. And then I'll be the laughing stock, and I'll be penniless, and I'll be homeless. All of those nightmares, which are actually rooted in fears that have nothing whatsoever to do with the company. And so the best way to respond to this is to really ask yourself a question like, do I really need to do this? Is it true that if we don't add these features, the product will fail and the company will fail and I'll be homeless and penniless and the laughing stock of my hometown? And chances are it's not true. That's that role of radical self-inquiry into the process.
I think the next question kind of bridges into that as well. Cassie asks, how many people believe that to be fulfilled at work, you must be passionate about what you do and feel like you devote yourself wholeheartedly to your job. Do you believe that people can live their fullest lives in roles that are just jobs, not passion projects? And how do you balance your personal passions with your professional self?
So love this question, Cassie. Thank you for it. I think that there's a conflation that occurs in a lot of the language that we use to describe it. And the conflation is like this. We merge love and fear, right? And what I say to people all the time is, it is okay to work hard. It is okay to love what you do. In fact, it's much more preferable, even if you, quote, just have a job and not a passion project, if you love the craft of what you do, if you love interacting with people. In fact, love of work is one of the great joys of the world. The problem is that, and there's a lot of messages that we receive about that, which is that somehow we merge fear of fill in the blank, right? This laundry list of all the things that we're terrified are going to happen. And we take that energy, which is invigorating, and we conflate that with love, which is also invigorating. And I think that by bringing mindfulness into what you're doing, why am I doing what I do? What's really at play for me? Radical self-inquiry. We get to parse out, oh, I'm doing this because I'm afraid that I will fail and disappoint my parents. What? I'm 35 years old. Or I'm doing this because the truth is, I love getting my hands wet with the clay and making pots. Mazel tov, go. Enjoy the work. I have coaching conversations every day, but I don't work every hour. I also ride my bike most days. I go to the gym most days. I journal every day. I talk to friends. I talk to family. And for me, it's all integrated. And living life with passion in that way.
That's a great answer. Integration can sometimes be hard, especially when we're so relentless in our work, and appreciate
Amen.
that perspective. Mitchell asks, if deep listening is embedded in who you are, but you don't have a background as prolific as someone like you, Jerry, how do you suggest an individual get connected to use this skill in a positive way?
I think it's a commitment, Mitchell, to practicing and being okay with not getting it right. You know, one of the corollary problems in our society is, for many folks, is a relentless pursuit of perfectionism, of perfection, and getting it right. And what I hear, Mitchell, in your question is that you're nervous about getting it wrong. And one of the great things about practicing with people that you are in conversation with is you can say, did I hear that right? Am I hearing you? Right? You can check it out. Hey, Eric, I heard you say this. Was that right? No, it was this, Jerry. Oh, okay. Let me listen more deeply. I hope that's helpful, Mitchell.
And a quick one from Ryan. What role has meditation played in your life? Is that something you find valuable, if any?
Yeah, I have been meditating now for 18 years.
Wow.
It's been a long set. No. Two quick stories. one of the great Tibetan teachers is a fellow named Marpa. And a student came to Marpa and said, "Oh, master, what is the path to enlightenment?" And he lifted up his robes and he showed his bare ass and he pointed to the calluses on his bun. What roles it played. I was walking in New York one time with my teacher, Sharon Salzberg, and we were going out to dinner. And she looked at me and she said, "You're just happy, aren't you?" And I said, "I should be. I've been your student for 14 years at the time. It's about time that I was happy." You know, the thing to remember about meditation is that we don't meditate to get better at meditation. We meditate to be better in the rest of our lives. So it is a foundation. It is a core way of dropping into who we really are. It's so integrated into who I am that I can no longer see it. It's like the water that I'm swimming in.
Wow. Emily asks, if it seems like successful founders often take bets on their intuition, but there is another side where we need to make analytical decisions. How do you coach founders to balance instincts with analysis and the mental confidence challenges that come with that?
Great question. And you're right in that deep listening to oneself, AKA intuition, is really an important skill for every leader, right? So let's just talk about that angle for a moment, and then we'll talk about the analytical piece of it. The deep listening to oneself, AKA intuition, means that you have to make a commitment to cutting through your own delusion. So how might that work? Well, I might be predisposed, pathological optimism again. I might be predisposed to say to myself, "No, this thing's going to work. I know this is going to work." And we may delude ourselves and say, "That's my intuition talking." And so what we want to do is balance that passion, balance that intuition, balance that feeling sense, and check it out using this other tool called discernment, intellectual capacity. Another Buddhist reference, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are many, many different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and saints. And one of my favorites is a guy named Manjari. And Manjari wields the sword, the flaming sword of prajna, which is wisdom that cuts through. And what great leadership demands is an integrated balance between the felt sense and an intellectual rigor. Now, how do we do that as a leader? You check it out with the people around you. See, if you are managing your own ego and your own wounds and creating psychological safety for the team around you, they get to say to you, "Hey, Eric, that idea that you have, it's kind of bullshit. It's not going to work." But if you are walking around toxically, using the organization to make yourself feel better about yourself, you're not going to have intellectual rigor of people around you to say, "Dude, you're wrong. The product is not going to work. That feature doesn't make sense. We're running out of cash. We're in trouble." I hope that's helpful.
We've got a few more minutes here, a couple more questions. If someone reads your book cover to cover, what do you really want them to walk away with?
The desire to read it again. The desire to hand it to other people. A very, very dear friend, a young woman in my life, read my book and called me up in tears. And she had found the courage after reading the book to call her parents and let them know that she was gay. Even though they knew that she knew that it would hurt their feelings, even though they're very loving parents. And she said to me, Jerry, you gave me permission to be me. When I wrote the book, the impulse I had, now I'm just thinking about that young woman. The impulse I had was to help leaders navigate the world. What I did not realize that I was doing was that I was giving permission to people to be themselves. And so the true answer to that feeling is, if someone walks away and puts down my book or listens to the audio and is done with the book and they say, okay, I have a right to exist on this planet just as I am. I have the right to love and to be loved and to feel safe experientially, existentially, spiritually, physically, and I know that I belong, then my work, then I did good work. And I can lay my head down on the pillow at night and say, to quote David White, good work done well for the right reasons.
Wow, that's powerful. If that's not a run to the bookstore reason for everybody that's watching today, I think everybody yearns for that. And that's an incredible purpose around your work. And thank you so much for being with us here today. When you think about what's next, Jerry, what project and book is next? Is there something that you have coming on the horizon? Is there something that you're digging into deeper? What's around the corner?
Well, REBOOT is flourishing, and I feel grateful for the work that we do, and we're doing some really interesting stuff. We're replacing the boot camp, at least for this year, with a virtual experience called the REBOOT Weekend, which I'm super stoked about. We're going to do some magical stuff. But with regard to the book, I have just begun the process of mapping out the next book, which is really fueled by the reactions that I've received from the first book. And in a sense, part of what I hope is a dialogue with a bunch of readers over a period of time. So at this point, I still have to put my proposal in. I still have to finalize things, but I'm hoping that will be out in the next couple of years.
Well, like we can't, none of us can wait, and can't wait to see that next body of work. And really appreciate you, Jerry, for all that you do, for entrepreneurs, for founders, for CEOs, and everybody that's part of our startup and innovation communities. We can feel your heart, we can feel your generosity, and that intrinsic value to make all of us the best we can be. And so thank you so much for being with us today and being part of this awesome Innovation Authors Showcase. You're a gift to the planet, and I pray and hope that everybody that was listening today runs to the bookstore, grabs your book, and starts their own journey if they haven't already. And so thank you. For those of you
and my thanks to everybody who listened in. Thank you.
For those of you who want to find Jerry, he mentioned early in the introduction that the work is more important than the business. I'm going to tell you a little about the business. You can find everything you need to know about Jerry Colonna at www.reboot.io. There's an awesome blog that you can dig into deeper topics. Obviously, can purchase his book, Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. He's got an amazing thought leadership podcast that his life partner is a cameo on throughout the site at all times. And most importantly, like some of our other amazing authors, Jerry truly lives the Give First ethos. And so he's just an email away from starting that journey, and just couldn't be more thankful for your presence in everything we do startup and for helping founders be better everywhere, Jerry. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.
Well, Denver Startup Week, we'll wrap up this session. Tomorrow we've got Arlen Hamilton. It's about damn time. Amazing venture capitalist and entrepreneur. And we'll end the week with Elliot Pepper and his newest book, Veil. And really going to be an exciting 2 more sessions to round out the week. Most importantly, there's been 235 pieces of content this week that have been for the community, by the community, for the future of the community, really focused on bringing together all things Denver, all things Colorado, all things innovation world to make all of our companies and all of us better. We want Denver Startup Week to be the most diverse, equitable, and inclusive and accessible event in the world. And this year, by being virtual and having awesome interpreters like Carrie, who we have on the call today, we hope that there's not an entrepreneur, a founder, anybody that's working in a high growth company or a small business anywhere around the planet doesn't have access to our work. And so as we queue up for tomorrow, I just want to say thank you again to MAPR Agency for your amazing work and stewardship in making this a reality. And please find yourself one of 235 sessions that you can enjoy outside of this between our founder, developer, design, spotlight, maker, growth, product, and people tracks. Denver Startup Week is for everyone, and there's more content just for you. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to you all tuning in tomorrow at 11 a.m. for Arlen Hamilton. Thank you so much, and have an amazing time starting up.